All right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. So about 8 weeks ago, I started in on a book, and I could not put it down. What makes the Coutts Diaries, Power, Politics, and Pierre Trudeau so compelling is that it is what it says it is, a written diary of exactly what went on in the back rooms of power during most of Pierre Trudeau's 15 years as Prime Minister. It's not conjecture, it's not speculation, it's the record. Meticulously transcribed, candid detail by candid detail, by Trudeau's principal secretary, Jim Coutts, one of the most powerful men in Canada, in his private diary. Today on the pod, the man who breathed life into those diaries over 40 years after the last entry, editing it all into one astonishing volume. Author and journalist Ron Graham is here. Ron is a multi-award winner and the man responsible for one of my favorite books on Canadian politics, One-Eyed Kings. Other notable works are The French Quarter and The Last Act, Pierre Trudeau, The Gang of Eight, and The Fight for Canada. He also edited Straight from the Heart and My Years as Prime Minister, the memoirs of the Right Honorable Jean Chrétien. So, Ron, I have been itching to dive into how this book came to be and get the juicy bits. Thank you for coming on the Herle Burly.
Thank you for having me. You've got a great program going, you and the team.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks very much. So, hey, just a little bit about you before we get into this. I mean, by your biography, you are a political biographer. How'd you get into that? Like, how did you,
Came
what
into
was your
it.
path to that?
Yeah, I came into it backwards. I began actually as a journalist in television. I was an associate producer of a seven-part series on Canadian business based on Peter Newman's book, The Canadian Establishment. So during the mid-'70s, late '70s, when I was actually in Ottawa, but working on that series, I wasn't paying much attention to what was going on. I was more focused on the business community and following these various players around, and it wasn't really my focus. And I guess after that, I joined, based on that series, I started freelancing for Saturday Night Magazine in its heyday, I think I would say. And they assigned me a political story. The first one actually I did was on Jean Chrétien. And this was before his run to John Turner. And turned out to be the first reporter on the Hill to actually go out on the road with him off the Hill. Turned out, and Saturday night was those generous days where you could spend several weeks with somebody and several months writing it. And so I spent a lot of time with him, and I followed out in the country. I saw his power and of his popularity, and I also saw how underestimated he was by the press corps and a lot of Ottawa. So I wrote this story saying, is this man the next Prime Minister of Canada? And of course, he wasn't going to be. He was in a tight race, an impossible race against John Turner. But that got me sucked into politics. And then they wrote about John Turner, and then I wrote about Joe Clark, and then I wrote about Brian Mulroney, and then I wrote about Norm Atkins, and then so I sort of went on, but I sort of got caught into it backwards. And more to this point of this book is both Pierre Trudeau and not so much Jean Chrétien. Well, yes, I guess Jean Chrétien before he left in his interim, after he quit the Turner's cabinet. But Coutts, all of them, I sort of got to know them after they had left power. So I got to know them into the '80s and '90s when I was writing One-Eyed Kings and other books. So I wasn't really living this period that I'm writing about now.
Right. Um, just you mentioned it, and I just have to touch on it. Um, how does the publishing industry with respect to political biography changed in Canada from 1986 to today?
Well, it used to be in the '70s, early '80s, I would say starting to change in the '90s. There was a market for it, and there were great books like Christina McCall Newman and even Peter Newman's books from the '60s on Diefenbaker and Pearson. There was a lot of biographies. There were a lot of vehicles, magazines, and newspapers. There was interest coming out of, I guess, out of the American interest of making of the president and these inside stories that were Watergate to an extent. So there was a lot of interest. There was a market. Therefore, there were advances. There were actually competitions among publishers to publish your books.
Right.
And I was lucky to hit that moment. And then the moment changed, there's a huge complexity of reasons, the collapse of the newspaper magazine industry, social media, public policy, publishing houses, all kinds of issues. But basically, it collapsed to the point where I had difficulty finding a publisher for the Coutts Diaries, both in the academic press and the non-academic press, the commercial press, because people felt there was no market for it. And they may turn out to be right. I don't know. I know that Sutherland House and Ken White are taking a gamble on it because they almost saw it as a public duty to put
Which
out.
it is.
I think so. And I felt so because this is so rich. And of course, the other David, that's sort of interesting is that in a place like England, every backbencher or every minor cabinet minister seemed to have written a 5-volume biography of memoir
Yeah.
of the time with all the salacious details. And they're enormously successful and they're very important. And they really are the bricks behind a history or a political culture of a nation. And we just don't have that in Canada. Coutts is one of the rare diaries. I mean, there have been some great exceptions like Mackenzie King and Charles Ritchie, etc.
But
But
nothing recent.
nothing recent, and even then, few and far between. You have to go a long way back. Chubby Power, a couple of others, but
Mm.
and some memoirs. But it's a real gap in our history and in our culture, and the publishing industry is not helping that gap.
Yeah. Last week, I likened TELUS's new sovereign AI factory to the Canadian Shield. Protective, impenetrable, Precambrian rock. I want to continue on that analogous terrain this week, Herle Burly-ites, and talk about the facility's granite-like security features. Starting with its location in Rimouski, Quebec, over 250 kilometers from any major urban center, making it ideal as a core or disaster recovery site. As you would gather, most clients of the factory are based in those big urban centers, so adverse effects like localized power outages or extreme weather are not going to impact both places. That means data can be safely stored in Rimouski as a secure, independent location. And a little like my Grey Cup champion riders, face it, you knew I was going to slip in a rider reference this week somehow. Like my riders, the AI factory employs a brilliant multi-layered defensive scheme. 24/7 monitored, multi-factor access controls stop unwanted individuals from entering the place physically. And advanced logical security like firewalls and encryption protocols protects your data from remote digital intrusion. Finally, there's the sovereignty piece, which I've talked about here before. TELUS's AI factory is sovereign by design, which means all data storage, processing, and operational control remain under Canadian jurisdiction and laws. So our businesses can innovate AI solutions on the world stage with the protection of a rock-solid, 100% Canadian-owned infrastructure. More next week. So let's get into the book. I've got some small questions, and then I've got some big questions.
Okay.
Let's start with the small questions. Why did he keep a diary? Do you know?
I think he kept a diary because he started one when he joined Pearson's office as a young man. He had been a whiz kid out in the Alberta Liberal Party. He ran twice, lost obviously because of
Such as it is.
such as it is.
Yeah.
And like his
I was
classmate.
a whiz kid in the Saskatchewan Liberal Party, such as it is.
You knew you know exactly what his fate was, and you probably how crazy you were at the time. I mean, he was going to university. His classmate was Joe Clark, and if you were an ambitious young politico, you'd probably be a Tory,
Right.
and sort
Alberta.
of a Tory like Clark was. But Jimmy, early on, not quite clear why. He had a mentor. He worked for a newspaper in Nanton. He had a mentor who was a liberal. He went to a liberal rally. Maybe it was a little bit of spin-off of John Kennedy. But anyway, he became a liberal, got into Pearson's office early as sort of a gopher. And he started keeping a diary then, sporadic, not very interesting, actually, most of it. And I think it was because of my guess would be because of Mackenzie King, that this is the type of thing you did was try to keep a diary, but he was never very good at it. And then there were these gaps, even when he came back in 73, 74 into politics, there were gaps. He was trying, but not always successfully. He was obviously trying to make it fuller than a notebook and fuller than just notes for a future memoir. And I really think that in the end, he felt it was almost a duty to be sort of a stenographer for history, that he just kept notes every
You
day.
you, th- you think from the outset he intended them to be published?
Uh, yes, 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 yes. But he never looked at them again after, even into his after politics years. And even then, he was writing essays and trying to write essays about his childhood in Nanton. And he knew the diaries were there. He used to gloat about these diaries. People knew he had these diaries, but nobody had ever read them. Maybe a couple of exceptions of a couple of pages, but nobody really knew what was in them. But I think he just felt that it was almost a responsibility to be a stenographer to history. And I think that the proof of that is that the day he leaves Ottawa to go and run in Spadina,
I
the
was going to ask you,
diaries,
why does he stop in 81? Because he's
because he had left the room. Basically, I think that his duty was to be the stenographer in the room, and it wasn't so much self-serving. I don't think. I mean, obviously, everything's self-serving a little bit, but he's pretty harsh on himself sometimes. He makes mistakes. He's honest. He's keeping records. He's critical, but also favorable to even his enemies. People feared a mean streak in him, and he had a mean streak, but they're not that evident in the diaries.
unless you're Al Graham.
I was going to say, the only person he really hates is Al Graham, who conversely was a liberal. I mean, he had fusses with other people, but the person who he relentlessly hates is Al Graham. Luckily, a relation of mine. But
I knew Al pretty well. He was an amiable fellow, but
yeah, but
yeah.
Jim had the sense, and it was partly Pierre Trudeau's fault, and he used to blame Trudeau, both in the diaries and outside the diaries, that Trudeau's extraordinary lack of interest in the party machine was largely responsible for the breakdown of the Liberal Party and the organization. And so at one point in the book, there's this strange moment where he's trying to get Keith Davey to be put in as president of the party over Al Graham. And Trudeau sort of backs it, but never backs it enough. And then Davey withdraws. And it's a sign of just how the party was falling apart. And Jim had sort of a optimistic feeling that he could revive the party, or a few good men could revive the party, men and women. But in fact, it never revived. And so Al Graham becomes the scapegoat for a lot of that. But he's
Yeah.
really quite rare, even in my edited version. I don't think I edited out anything that was
Well, we're
tough.
gonna get to it. I'm a little bit more. I see a little bit more there. Maybe we'll get to it. We'll
Okay.
get to it. But how much of the diaries are we seeing?
Well, it's hard to know. There's 52 volumes in all, and I would say of those 52 volumes, after a lot of them after 81, which are most of them, are more like scrapbooks than diaries. There's photographs, there's travel journals, there's bits and pieces. I couldn't find
Mm.
anything except a little bit around Trudeau's funeral that ends the book. That's really was worth recording. The Pearson stuff is sporadic, so that's a couple of volumes. The 73, 74, 75 are sporadic. 77 is missing altogether. It turns out he didn't keep a diary mostly in 77.
Right.
So it's hard to exactly know. And then I had to cut down because I was already given, even for Sutherland book, it was getting a little large, and they were worrying about the price. So I couldn't put everything in. And there's a lot of
Is that
tedious.
available somewhere else?
Yeah, they're in the archives. The
Okay.
archives are open at Trinity College, and the full diaries are now accessible to academics, and they're all there. But a lot of them, what's interesting, David, is that in his meetings or in his days in the diaries, he's recording everything from dawn till dusk. So every lunch has 5 pages of what he was talking about at lunch, even if the person was I don't know, party organizer from Northern
Mm.
Ontario or something. So there's a lot of gossip over dinner about people, none of it particularly interesting. Even for a Coutts biographer, I don't think it's interesting. It's sort of marginally interesting. Somebody had a divorce or somebody's getting married or something. Uh, so those were easy to take out. Um, but what I tried to do was basically keep the narrative run on the key issues that were public, even if they're not issues now. And occasionally, I will put in a bit like a sentence or two that he's having a debate or meetings about the Saskatchewan wheat pool, just to alert a historian that there's more in the diaries about that subject. There's a lot about party organization that I cut out, but it's there for a historian. But I sort of signal it without going down to detail. So I don't know exactly whether this is 30% or 25% of what's all there, but I'm fairly confident that it's the meat of the diaries. I don't think I left out anything except for in a specialty way that was important.
Why would, given the mission that you outlined to me of being the person in the room that was recording for history, why would he have wanted the personal elements of it to be published? I mean, I felt sad reading those things, right? I mean, he's got one love in his life and it's unrequited.
Yeah.
And most of his social life is spent playing poker and all hours of the night, drinking
Mm,
heavily and
mm,
losing large amounts of money, staggering amounts of money by the
mm,
70 standards, by
mm,
the way.
mm.
Um, so why would he why would he have wanted that published?
I
And what did
think,
you think the public
right,
interest was in that?
right. Okay, so there's two things. One is that I think once he got going on the diary and he was describing his day, that stuff went in. And plus, to say a lot of other dinners with people and personality stuff and gossips and lunches. And he sort of recorded the whole day, not just the official business. I think that's just sort of once he got caught in trying, at the end of the day, trying to record the day, which is actually amazing when you think at the end of these days, he was actually sitting down and
Yeah.
for an hour or two and either writing or dictating this stuff. But nevertheless, I think he got into a role of this was my day, and the personality stuff, the visits home to his parents, the poker games, which by the way I really cut out. Some of them are not only are there more of them, but some of them he analyzes in great detail. I moved this, I moved that.
Where did his money come from that he could afford to lose 10 grand in a night in 1977?
He made quite a bit of money. He in the when he was exiled from power, if you want, after '68, he was lumped in with the Burstonians, and particularly Keith Davey and John Nickel, who were blamed for not giving Pearson a majority.
Right.
So he went out with them, and he went to Harvard Business School before that. He came back. He set up something called Canada Consulting with a couple of people who became very wealthy, including people who owned the Toronto Star. And so he had a nest egg, which he actually describes in some detail. Before he goes to the PMO, he says, I've got to get, in those days again, $125,000 or something in order to live comfortably before I can go back into. So he had money. Um, uh, but I don't think, and I think he won some too. I mean,
Yeah, well,
it
yeah.
wasn't relentless, but and later on, after he retired, he made a lot of money. He got made some good
Yeah, yeah.
investments
I've heard that.
and became again a bit of a shopaholic. He when I knew him, he didn't play poker, but he shopped, and he probably lost more money shopping than he did playing poker.
Well, you can do that. So, when the Prime Minister stood up in Terrace, British Columbia earlier this month and talked about six more major projects his government hopes will transform a Canadian economy under threat, he called back in history for comparisons and picked out a small rail line he said once united the Maritimes around the time of Confederation. It was established to move cargo and troops eastward and assert Canada's independence, he explained, and bolster a young country. That rail line, said Prime Minister Carney, eventually became Canadian National Railway, stretching from Halifax to Vancouver and Prince Rupert, moving $250 billion worth of cargo each year, driving huge economic activity and employing nearly 25,000 Canadians. That, said the PM, and this is a quote, is the power of nation building projects, projects that Canadians have built before, and projects that we are starting together to build again. End quote. Well, beyond bursting its buttons with civic pride at being singled out by the Prime Minister as a generational example of nation building, Our sponsor, CN, is fully on board with the idea of clearing away bureaucratic obstacles and fast tracking energy and mining projects. Canada has critical minerals, gas, and other energy the world needs, and CN will be, without doubt, part of delivering it. These are fraught times. What the government is attempting to jumpstart are the sorts of collaborative, subsuming national efforts Canadians undertook in response to past crises like wars and depressions. Rail cargo transport will inevitably be part of any solution. CN is ready. Let's get to my big questions,
Great.
my big takeaways from this. The first one is I have read a lot about the 70s and Trudeau, and I'm a bit of a Trudeau file. And I read Grits, and I read Northern Magus, and I read Red Wansky's book, all that kind of stuff. Nothing, nothing told me how bad this government was. No journalist writing about this seemed to capture how shambolic that 74 to 79 Trudeau government was, according to these diaries. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was reading. A cynical operation without purpose, a prime minister that literally couldn't care at all about the economy as it spiraled downward, a weak and divided ministry, people that I thought were political giants being trashed by Coutts. Like, that's a bad government, as he describes it, like a really bad government.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree. It was an eye-opener for me too. There were, interestingly enough, I'm not sure there was scoop in the sense that people knew that Trudeau had sort of checked out from 74,
Yeah, that's
75.
right. That's the general narrative is there's a
And there was
malaise,
like
but
all the
not to
stretched up,
this, not to
not
this detail.
not to this detail, not to this detail. Also, not just how checked out he was, except on the Constitution. And Jim wasn't on the constitutional file, which is important to state. And also, Tom Axworthy, when I talked to him about the book, and of course he's in the book, and he was saying,
Very flatteringly, as he
well,
should be.
yeah,
I'm a
exactly,
big fan of Tom's.
a key, very much more interesting, much more important than I suspected. And he said, to an extent, you might have to see the diaries as a little bit of screaming into the pillow at night. That it wasn't maybe quite as bad as some of those, particularly those cabinet ministers, and there's a little bit of venting at the end, not so much to self-serve, but more just to express some frustration. But so even considering that, the reality was, as you say, uh, well, there's a couple of things, the realities. One is that during this period, 74, 75, inflation, stagflation, wage and price controls, no wage and price controls, spending, cutting, basically nobody knew what to do and there. And anybody who had an idea what to do was in conflict with somebody else who had another idea what to do. So the at one point Trudeau's this amazing where Jimmy organizes a bunch of business guys to go in and speak to him, and that was a whole story about his Trudeau's relationship with business and the media. And basically at the end, it's going quite well until at the end Trudeau says to them, "Well, of course, nobody knows what to do about inflation." And they're sort of their jaws drop
Mm.
because they were, and then later on, when they're trying to do the fix, the 8-point program, and all these things that they're trying to patch together, and studies and committees and all that stuff, Trudeau basically says to Coutts and Pitfield, when they're asking him, why aren't you paying more attention? He says, you know, my heart's not in this stuff. I can't, you can give me something, I can tell a good policy, but I'm not going to go to the bat for small business or, you know, something. And you realize he had focused already because of the Quebec, Parti Québécois victory, and because of the Alberta oil crisis, which started really early and was on his agenda really early. I mean, he had a particular interest in energy policy going back to 72 with the first APEC crisis. So those two, beyond those two files, it was petty stuff to him. He just didn't, and he was caught in a game, which is to your point, which is I always knew because, you know, I did work with Pierre Trudeau. I always knew that he wasn't in love with that job, particularly at the time of the breakup of his marriage and the single parenting of his 3 kids. But I hadn't realized just how much he hated having to perform both politically and as prime minister. He could turn it on as a great actor can, but there's one point where I think it's one of the wage and price control speeches, and they're in the car going back, and he'd been given the speech 5 minutes before reading it on nationwide television. And there was a screw up about its French translation and everything was running around. And he read this thing and the car going back. And he said, as a professor, I wouldn't do that to my students. You're asking me to go on national television to read this statement with no preparation and no thought and no debate. And he clearly didn't like that. It wasn't him. And that comes through, which makes him not only uninterested as you or disinterested as you're saying, but also really difficult to work for. They're trying to focus him on something. He's talking about his house, or he's talking about his next holiday, or he's talking about whether he should take a woman on the boat to Germany, and he becomes really difficult. And that was an eye opener to me. It doesn't, on the other hand, I'll just finish with this point. It doesn't negate what he did in the third term.
No, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I agree with that. I fully agree with that.
And so even by 79, at Radwanski, everybody's saying he's a failed prime minister. He's unfulfilled potential. When he left in 79, people thought, okay, he's a dud. And so in that point, the word was already out. We just don't know how big a dud.
There's a thing in the diaries that, because for those of us who are liberals and Trudophiles and all that stuff, even though that government has been criticized a lot over the years, there's something about Trudeau that's seen as very high-minded and principled and all that stuff. And there's a segment in the diaries where the liberals, the government has abolished capital punishment in 1976. And by 1977, they're in so much trouble politically that they're talking about bringing it back. And Otto Lang the justice minister actually brings a proposal to cabinet to have a national referendum on capital punishment. And they have a big debate in cabinet and it's divided, and ultimately Trudeau says no, but not out of any principle, out of fatigue, out of, I can't go through this issue again, blah, blah, blah. And then Alan McCacken says at the end of it, he says, well, we have to believe in something. It might as well be this.
Yeah.
Well, what a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, they're floundering. They're floundering in the polls. They're floundering on when to have an election. They're floundering on whether Trudeau even wants to stay to run even before 79. I mean, he's constantly from 77 to 79, he's talking about leaving or being pushed out. So they're floundering, and they've got a leader who is obsessed by a very important issue. I mean, you've got to remember 76, the PQ comes in and the country is in danger. And you've got a major international oil crisis. Plus, you've got an economic crisis that nobody can figure out. The Americans are trying to do it with Carter. And I mean, it's a mess. So you have that. But more to the point, what I took from reading that was, and I think this is one of the points of the book, is that everybody in here is a human being. They're a confused, conflicted human being, caught up in history, caught up in power, caught up in reputation, but basically caught up in lives that are, divorces and alcoholism and poker games and resignations and ego trips and fighting over office space and jockeying for power and insecure and I think, to me, that's the message of the book, or the most interesting thing for a political junkie, is that these great figures of history, these insiders, when you're inside, they're just a bunch of people.
I once, in the middle of the
ordinary folk in extraordinary positions, with the whole world, or at least all of Canada, watching every move in public every day. And to be reminded of that is, I think, a very important lesson from the book.
For sure.
The following is a political advertisement. To build a strong Canadian economy, we need a Made in Canada plan. Public service workers power our economy. They support small businesses and keep our supply chain moving. Canada's economic resilience relies on having strong public services. To strengthen our economy, we need to invest in public services. Learn how at forucanada.ca. This message was paid for by the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
Again, all of the things that I have in my life read or watched or consumed about Pierre Trudeau. Now, the old saying is, no man is a hero to his valet. Nothing has made Pierre Trudeau seem as ordinary to me as these diaries. Just a guy.
Yeah.
Just a guy. A brilliant guy, a guy capable of great heights, but most days, just a guy who's disinterested in large parts of his job, preoccupied with his marriage, doesn't, just a regular guy.
Yeah. And I think that with the exception of these moments of brilliance.
And I guess I should have known that, but I was been a little starstruck my whole life.
I was going to say, for somebody who's been inside the room so much, you must know that these are just people. And when you get past the public myth and they're just, it's astonishing. And one forgets that. Even sometimes their minions forget to remind them that they're people, like those Roman emperors who tell you're not a god. Hang on a second, you're not a god. But every now and then, again, recognizing that Jim wasn't in the constitutional file, he's deep into the energy file, but he wasn't in the constitutional file. And there's a moment in the book where I think it's May 80, a month or so after the referendum.
Yeah.
And they're floundering around. They have no game, even coming into the referendum, they have no game plan. Things are chaos. Chrétien's running around. I mean, it's just the sense of confusion and out of your back pocket sort of policy. And at one point, Trudeau comes in, and Jimmy actually says this is one of the best meetings we've had in months and months and months and months and months, because Trudeau comes down and says, I have been thinking, this is the way we're going to get the Constitution. We're going to do this meeting. We're going to move unilaterally. It's going to be in 2 stages. If they don't like it, we're going for a referendum. It's going to be this. And he actually outlines the strategy, not the timing, because the wheels fell off that bus in terms of timing. Yeah. But he actually outlined, this is the way I'm going to get this Constitution, and this is what I'm going to do. At the same time, we'll work in conjunction with Alberta and the energy stuff. The wheels also fall off that bus. But basically every now and then you will see Trudeau, or Jimmy will be talking about him.
Interesting that Trudeau is the guy that says to Coutts, are we pushing Alberta too far with this national energy program? Yeah.
And he even says at one point, are we pushing Quebec too far? It's really interesting. He said, and Coutts's, and Pitfield's makes that, but more Coutts's resistance to bilingualism and to constitutional reform, because Coutts's mandate was Alberta and Ontario. And so he kept saying, don't push this stuff too hard, even though he knew it was the core of his boss's thinking. But he was sort of always pulling back a little bit. But yeah, so every now and in the elections too, there'll be this great backroom stuff. I find, as an election junkie, like maybe you, the backstory, and I had to cut quite a lot of the election stuff because it got repetitive. I didn't do every city they went to and every night, so I had to put the highlights of each election, each of the 3. But you'll get Coutts suddenly seeing Trudeau really going well, and he said, "This is the master at it. This is Mackenzie. This is the old Liberal stuff. He was fantastic." And then you'd get back into the car, and you'd have Margaret saying, "Oh, you were so boring. You're such a boring old man," or Coutts or Trudeau saying, "I didn't do well, did I? How did I do? Why didn't my jokes land?" And so you're getting the public Trudeau, which is magnificent when it's magnificent, and then human when it's not so magnificent.
Right. Coutts really seemed, you talk about elections, Coutts really seemed to me quite distant from the Liberal Party machinery that was just one level below. I don't mean the party out there, but I meant like the people that I know as major historical figures in that period of time are really barely mentioned in the book, in the diaries. Like, I don't know how many references to Jerry Grafstein there are, but not many, if any. Marty Goldfarb seems only to talk to Keith, and Keith relays Marty's numbers to to Coutts. There's no sort of evidence of Coutts meeting with Goldfarb to talk strategy or to get debriefed on the numbers. Seems odd to me.
Well, that was sort of the role division that Coutts was in Ottawa at Trudeau's side doing strategy, policy, working with Tom Maxwell, the platform committee, the MPs, the senators, that type of
Yeah.
thing. And then he was on daily, if not hourly, communication with Davy in Toronto about how to unfold this strategy. And it was Davy working with Grafstein and Goldfarb, and that those Toronto people
Mm.
weren't in Ottawa that ran that show. So there really was a division of responsibility, and they touched occasionally, but basically it was they touched through a daily, hourly communication between the two men to keep on the same page. Grafstein doesn't show up again because he's more Toronto than Ottawa. Goldfarb does show up just before Jim is about to run for Spadina, and ominously tells them that it's a lock-in. So they meet, but even in the diaries, there's not much of those people that was left on the floor, I don't think. And there are bits where Davy complains, particularly after 76, 77, 78, he'll phone and complain to Coutts, "You're leaving me out. I'm not a player there. I'm not in the inside circle. You're keeping things from me." And Jimmy has to go and hold his hand and say, "No, I'm not, and I'll do better," and yada yada yada. But there was but there was a different job assignment.
Well, but this takes me to another one of my big takeaways, which is when I first got involved in the Liberal Party in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Coutts and Davy was a phrase, right?
Right.
Like they were two parts of the same thing.
Right.
And that's what people talked about, the power of Coutts and Davy.
Yes.
This diary tells me something very different. This diary tells me that Keith Davy was not on Jim Coutts's level. That certainly not with the prime minister and not generally in terms of influence. He's somewhere between where Coutts is and where other players are, but it's not Coutts. It's Coutts and Pitfield.
Yes.
It's Coutts and Pitfield. And everybody knows about Pitfield's enormous role in that government, but I was stunned at how partisan his role was.
Yeah.
I was stunned at how political he was. I was stunned at how involved he was in discussions about Trudeau's leadership, about party affairs and party matters, about electoral planning, all these kinds of things, all of which make me think, why was he surprised that Clark fired him? He was a Liberal operative.
All right. I agree with that. Michael was a weird person. He was shy, socially awkward, slightly isolated, in fact, very isolated in many ways. He had been a Trudeau, he was one of the ones with Mark Malone who invented Pierre Trudeau in the early 60s and encouraged him to run. He was always on the inside room. He was always a Trudeau advisor. He gets promoted twice to the clerk of the Privy Council against the objection of a lot of both cabinet ministers and the civil service. So they're very, very tight, and the book makes clear just how tight it was, and it also makes clear how naive Pitfield was to think that he wasn't going to be fired by Joe Clark. I mean, obviously, but that was clear to Joe
Might as
Clark.
well have kept Coutts on.
It was clear.
Yeah.
It was clear to everybody there. But what's interesting when you talked about when I was doing this book, I went back. I don't usually reread my old stuff.
Right.
When I was working on this, I went back to One-Eyed Kings, and there in a section is a really clear statement about the Coutts-Pitfield relationship, the power of Pitfield, the parti pris of Pitfield, their tightness. In fact, there's descriptions of the two I almost put into the book here as one of my if it didn't sound like bragging, but it was there. But Pitfield was just an odd guy in the same way that Jim, even though he knew that how bad his reputation was getting and could be, especially in certain circles, he was surprised by losing Spadina. Came as a total shock, and it came even more of a
In a
shock.
pretty safe seat.
Yeah, yeah, according to up to the week before, and then and then to be censored by the party.
The only way to lose that riding was to make it a national symbol of something, which is what they did,
Yeah, yeah, that's
right?
right. Yeah, that's right. And the now part of that is it's the fate of every political principal secretary to take the arrows that are aimed for the prime minister. So that was that. Uh, Jimmy made a lot of enemies along the way, or a lot of people jealous of his power along the way, and he was never shy about his power. He let people know how much power he had, particularly when Trudeau was so disinterested in so many subjects. It was picked up by Coutts and Pitfield primarily, Lalonde and McEachern. So it was the Gang of Five. And the whole idea of the Gang of Five, I don't know until this book whether anybody knows about the Gang of Five, and that Trudeau actually called it the Gang of Five. And when Coutts is going off to Spadina, and Trudeau says, "Well, okay, I'll back you and get you into the cabinet and all that, but I really hate the breakup of the Gang of Five." And so when we talk about centralization, there it is in all its glory or infamy.
Did you know that Canada is a global leader in the production of medical isotopes? Canadian isotopes are life-saving tools used around the world every day to diagnose and treat cancers, sterilize medical equipment, and advance medical research. For decades, Canadian nuclear innovation has powered breakthroughs across healthcare, industry, and research. And today, through the Isotopes for Hope campaign, the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council is working to double our isotope production by 2030. Why? Because the world is counting on Canada. Medical isotopes are a promise that patients will get faster, more accurate diagnoses, a promise that hospitals will have the tools they need to precisely treat cancer and other diseases, and a promise that Canada will continue to lead in the development of nuclear technologies that benefit people here at home and around the world. From our CANDO power reactor fleet to our accelerator network, from research labs to hospitals, Canadians are driving innovation that brings hope and saves lives. By supporting Isotopes for Hope, we're not only securing Canada's leadership in the global isotope market, but we're also helping build a healthier future for everyone. The world is counting on us, but we can only rise to this challenge if we work together. It will take all of us, industry, the healthcare sector, governments, and the scientific community, all aligned to maximize the potential of Canadian-made isotopes and ensure that we continue to bring hope to patients when they need it most. Learn more at www.canadianisotopes.ca. Well, the ministry of that area is not given a lot of credit in this book. The only minister that thought came off well in these diaries was Lalonde.
Yeah.
And some people who were giants, like McEachern, comes off very poorly in the book overall, generally, I would say.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you're right, but both fit. There are extraordinary moments between Coutts and Pitfield about McEachern, and they both recognize that he was past his due date. I mean, they give him credit for what he had done in the past, but they
Mm.
were basically saying he's the old man's lost his mojo
Yep.
and he's lost his energy, he's lost his vision, he's confused. It was a horrible appointment to put him in finance as an old lefty, and so it's quite again poignant where they'll say just how he was past his time in the same way that it's not as in much detail, but there's also that sense with Paul Martin Sr. that he is beyond his due date.
Mm.
And so again, there's a human element there that's moving, I think, but also another sign of your instinct that this is a government that doesn't really know what it's doing because they put McEachern in there and he didn't know what he was doing.
Right.
And so Lalonde, I don't know, Lalonde, the others are, you're right, there's not, some people, Jimmy liked John Roberts, and there were people he liked and people who did their, but nobody
He
really.
fought to get Roberts in cabinet, but then there's no reference to Roberts ever again as a consequential person.
Right. Well,
Right.
yeah, there's more of Roberts in the Rare Diaries, but that's more Roberts fussing about how do I get more power. That's in the book. Roberts fuss. I thought it was
Yeah.
actually an interesting quote. Roberts fussing about how I don't get any voice in the cabinet, and Jimmy actually giving him a lesson. Well, maybe it's because you don't schmooze enough with the other. And you don't give somebody something in order to get something back. And it's actually a nice little mini
Yeah, it is.
lecture on how to be a good cabinet minister. But
It is. So, all right, Ron. One of the things that really took me personally aback in this book
Paul
were
Martin Jr.
were the sections about Paul Martin Jr., Paul Martin, and Jean Chrétien.
Yeah.
Both of them. And so, I've known Paul well from the mid 80s. And he has told me over the years that he had a friendship with Jim Coutts. But I didn't realize how close that friendship was at all. And I certainly didn't realize that Paul had wanted to be leader of the party back as early as 1979, right? And between Chrétien demanding to be leader every time he talks to Coutts, and Coutts is sick of Chrétien through most of this book, Chrétien demanding for Trudeau to quit so that he can be leader, and Paul Martin talking to him about being leadership, I feel like I wandered into a rivalry that had been going on for a decade before I entered it. And I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think well, just take them one at a time. The Martin stuff is interesting because they were very, very close friends. At one point, I think, I'm not sure it's in the diary, but certainly in the unedited version, where that Paul Martin was his closest friend in politics. They were very tight. And they were linked through Power Corps and going to these Texas shoots and all that stuff. They were tight.
The Quail were bad this year.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines. And that's a whole story. But anyway, that's another story. So they were tight. And at the beginning, of course, Paul saying, Jimmy, if you ever run, I'm behind you 100%. And then it's like, if you ever run, I'm 50% behind you and 50% for me. And then it gets down. If you ever run, I hope you'll be, because I'm 80% me. And you could just see this, and Jimmy getting more and more impatient with this idea, which I think is really interesting. As a lesson in politics, you can't enter politics to be the leader. It's just you can't go into the game with the idea that you're going to be the leader. It's just
tell it to Mark Kearney.
Exactly. He might even have the luck of he's an exceptional prime minister. So that ambition was there from the beginning, and it's really remarkable how Martin seems to talk about them. And there's lots and lots and lots of conversations in the diaries about the two of them talking, because there were many visits in the Eastern Townships and many social events and all that type of thing. Mm. Martin talks about nothing but the leadership. It's not like suddenly he's going off about, let's do this for the economy or let's do that for the economy. There's nothing but the leadership when they get together. Now, maybe that's because Jimmy's editing that at the end of the day, but nevertheless, it seems to be a pattern. The Chrétien stuff is really interesting because
it's likely that there's some editing there, because Paul was always very careful to couch his ambition in grander motive. He would have been doing that with Jim too.
I'm not sure, or Jim wasn't listening. Or Jim wasn't listening, but it's not there. It's just party votes.
Right.
And Jim, of course, did have some ambitions, but he was always being pushed. I mean, he always had these people saying, "Oh, you got to be a leader," including Trudeau, saying, "Oh, you got to be a leader." And he was astute enough to know that he probably had 15%, 20%. The odds were against him.
Well, wait a second. Well, let's get to that in a second.
Okay, now let's get to it. So
let's finish up on the other side of it, though, which is Chrétien, which is, you got to give me this, Ron. You got to give me this. Apparently, in 1978, he says, "Listen, 10 years is long enough."
Yeah.
Which There's
Yeah.
a historical irony to that.
Yeah. Well, except that we're not going to get into this swamp, but the Chrétien did actually prepare to leave at 10 years. And if he hadn't been given 4 more months, he would have gone. Anyway, that's another issue.
Yeah.
The the Chrétien stuff is interesting because, well, it's interesting on all kinds of levels. But first of all, Trudeau was low in the polls. He was going to lose the 79 election. There was talk about a leadership. There was talk about McDonald. There was talk about Turner coming back. There was talk about leadership in the air, and Chrétien was really pissed off for having been left out in '78 on that cutback thing, the so-called
Yep.
uh, Schultz visit, which the truth is in this book, unlike any other book you'll read. We finally got the story of behind those cuts, and
Yeah.
Chrétien
Yeah. Yeah.
left out, and it was as bad as Chrétien suspected. It was a Jimmy Axworthy Pitfield play that Trudeau delivered for
Yeah.
them. So Chrétien was so Trudeau was weak, and they were blaming Chrétien for some of it. There were people out for him, and he was much more insecure. What's interesting to me, knowing him well, having done books with him afterwards, is that the pre-1980 Chrétien, I only met him, I guess, I wrote about him in 1980. So the pre-1980 Chrétien, the pre-referendum charter Chrétien, was a much more insecure and confused human being than the one after 1980. So even in the 1970s, not in the diaries, he was talking about going to become leader of the Quebec Liberal Party. He was talking about lists. He was talking about going to get money. He was being screwed around. He had ambitions, but he didn't have the confidence to really do it. Blah, blah, blah. And it culminates with this great, great line, which he had forgotten, where he says, if they're going to get rid of a French Canadian, they're getting rid of the wrong one if they get rid of me.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, but it's a period piece, and he's probably not. I haven't spoken to him about it, his reading of it, but my guess is that he's probably not happy with the portrait, and I think his team is
Oh,
really,
he would hate it.
yeah,
He would absolutely hate it, right?
yeah. And he would say it's because Jimmy he had the leadership ambitions more than, so they were rivals in that sense. They were friends, but they were also rivals. I mean, there's a certain amount of respect for what Chrétien was delivering, particularly during the referendum, but they were rivals as well as friends. And the 78, Chrétien knew that the 78 fiasco was Coutts's, and it almost caused him to resign as finance minister, which would have been really exceptional. Again, we've lost a couple of finance ministers, but it's big news.
Right, it's Coutts, but you can't do that without Trudeau, Pitfield, and Tommy Shoyama all agreeing.
Yes, that's right. And Axworthy coming up with the trick.
Right.
Let's do these cuts. They've been trying to get cuts for a year. The ministers were dragging their heels, and finance and they thought this was going to be one of their solutions to their polling problems. So they said, okay, we got to do this. And it was actually Axworthy, interestingly enough, who says, why don't we blame it on Germany? And we'll get the prime minister come back and read this big speech. But the speech was actually written weeks before because they thought they were going into an election.
Right.
And anyway,
but I've actually read in books of that era that Helmut Kohl convinced Trudeau to do that. Right.
That was the line that Axworthy invented, and Pitfield to an extent, and Coutts went along.
Not Kohl, Schmidt.
Yeah.
Schmidt, right? Not Kohl, Schmidt.
No,
yeah. Yeah.
That's what they invented that. They already had the speech and the idea. They didn't know, and the numbers. I mean, what's incredible in that moment is you get, okay, we're going to take 10 billion out, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and then Pitfield wants to leave the post office in, and Coutts just takes the post office in and cuts another 2 billion without telling Pitfield till Trudeau reads that I mean, it's a remarkable moment but it's probably not a good way to govern.
Yeah, no, it's not a great governance example.
So the Chrétien stuff is, in the end, I think it's a period impression colored by their rivalries, but not the full Chrétien in the same way that probably the Martin isn't the full Martin either, or the Mulroney isn't the full Mulroney.
So I'd like to end, Ron, by talking about
Are we
something
running out
that
of time already? This is so much fun.
I know it's so much fun. I know it's so much fun, and we may have to continue it off of the podcast, but is we we have some disagreements here we could still noodle over. But I'd like to know what you know about what happened to Jim Coutts. So he stops the diary in 1981 when he goes to run in the by-election. He loses in the by-election, as we all know. But he immediately commits himself to running again in the general. And he prepares himself to run for the leadership of the party. So despite whatever we've been saying about, other people thought were pushing him, he decides he should be the leader of the party. And remember, he wrote a book preparing to run for leadership of the party. And he found that he had no support, which frankly, odd that would surprise him, right? Odd that would surprise him. But we're talking about 1984, and he finds he's got no support. And to my eye, he disappears from public life, from the Liberal Party. I don't know. I mean, I do know a little bit, but I don't really know. Why did Jim Coutts never do anything in politics again? Why did he never appear? Why did you never see him at a convention? Why did he never appear as an advisor to anybody? Why did he, what happened to Jim Coutts?
I think there are two things. One is that you were probably there and can refresh my memory because I wasn't there and I haven't really read about it. But I understand at the '84 convention, Liberal convention, he was actually censored by a motion denouncing the centralization.
1982.
Okay.
1982 was a young Liberal motion that led to a reform movement in the party, and it deliberately castigated cynical moves like the Spadina by-election. Because remember, he lost the Spadina by-election not because of what he'd done as principal secretary. He lost the Spadina by-election because of the cynicism of creating the by-election, of taking an undistinguished member from a very safe Liberal riding and putting them in the Senate so that he could be a member of Parliament.
Exactly.
That is what the residents said no to.
That's right. And I agree with that. And so it's 82, he's censored by his party. 80, he's anti-Turner from the beginning, but he runs in 84 anyway. I'm not sure why. And I wasn't around. I don't know anything about that. Whatever happened, those culminations of those two losses and that censor by the party that he gave his life to basically said, and he was out then. From when Turner came in, he was out for 4 years or whatever the period was. He wasn't close, as we know, to Chrétien, even though he was close to the family and connections and all that type of thing. He wasn't an insider there. He wasn't consulted. He wasn't. He wasn't. He played a little bit of games around the backroom advice around the various leaderships, Ignatieff, Ray, Dion, a little bit.
I didn't know. So he was talking to those people?
Yeah, but in a strange sort of way, he was talking to them. I mean, he was a he was sort of he'd play many games. He'd look at different leadership contenders and try to find this and offer some advice at the provincial level. He wrote some op-eds for I think he had a regular op-ed column in the Toronto Star about public policy. But he basically wasn't consulted at the highest level. He had been burnt deeply by the party. He was out to make money in a comfortable life, and he did a lot of philanthropy around the Pearson College and the Nature Conservancy, and he got very close there with Jerry Butts, and some people might say he invented Jerry Butts, but nevertheless wasn't
Played a mentoring role with Justin, did he not?
No, I mean, I don't think so. He had a mentoring role with Butts, but I don't think. In fact, I think he encouraged Justin not to run, or he had great doubts about Justin. And I think he had doubts about Bob Rae, and I don't think he supported Bob. I think he did supported Gerald Kennedy in that. So he just was lost, and he kept trying to find. I remember at one point he got excited about Tobin, and but it was just not serious, and he wasn't taken seriously. So he made money in his business. He traveled, he did his garden out in Alberta, he socialized, he had a good time. He also got heavily into drinking.
You're describing a man to me that was bored to shit. If you love politics the way he loved politics, and if you had been in the positions he had been in, the life you are describing is hell.
except that he actually was a man of phenomenally deep interests. So he really was interested in gardening. He really was interested in philanthropy. He really was interested in mentorship. He really was interested in travel. He really was interested in birding. He really was interested in the opera and music. I mean, he was a deeply engaged philanthropist and connoisseur of all kinds of things. Um, that didn't mean he wasn't bitter at his core about what his legacy was, and how he was treated. And didn't mean that he wasn't lonely in his personal life. But the only thing I would say at the end is when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, he could have saved himself. He decided to take all kinds of new agey therapies, and he didn't do the surgery that was recommended. And we always thought around him that it was taking his own life. He died much earlier than he needed to, and that's the only
Wow.
evidence or thing I would say to agree with to support what you're saying. The person I knew, he wasn't quite as vivacious and happy as he had been in the 70s when he was the life of the party, but he was a tremendously agreeable person to be with. And he was having a full, rich life, even though at the heart of it, I think there was an unfulfilled side or a bitter side. And that concludes the book, where he actually goes to Pierre Trudeau's funeral and admits in this little diary entry that's post all the other ones, we weren't really friends. We had a relationship, but Pierre Trudeau similarly had also the same bitter loneliness inside himself after he lost in 84 or left in 84.
Right.
Uh, they shared that. It was um, they had enough of the game, and the game burnt them.
Yeah. Did Coutts feel that he and Pearson had been friends?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in sort of a mentor,
Yeah.
they shared the sense of humor, and of course they looked alike. There's this famous line when they're doing a documentary, Cameron Graham's famous documentary on Pearson, and Coutts is in every other reel,
Hmm.
and Pearson says, "Oh, for God's sakes, the country will think my grandson is running the show." So yeah, they shared sense of humor. They liked baseball. Pearson was a much more collegial, fun, and he got a kick out of Coutts. And Coutts is one of his jobs with Trudeau was to try to lighten the atmosphere around that office. So he was one of the few people who could actually make Pierre Trudeau laugh, to lighten it, to just to Trudeau was a really serious guy, and very solitary, and Pearson was amiable, fun, whatever.
Why didn't Trudeau like Coutts in a personal way?
He did like Coutts in a personal way. They just weren't. Trudeau had no friends. I
Well,
mean,
that's not can't be true.
yes,
Can't be true. I mean, I'm struck not in a way that's good governance, but in a kind of a political loyalty way by how much Pierre Trudeau thought about how Jean Marchand was doing, or
yes,
how Jean Marchand would do if you dropped him from the cabinet,
yes.
or what might ultimately happen to Jean Marchand. Like he seemed to care about him.
Right. That was a rare one. But for example, the other one, who the part of the Three Doves, was Peltier.
Yeah,
Peltier, by that point, had gone to Paris, wasn't around, but they were very, very close. The Three Doves and all that. They go back a long way into the
yeah.
50s, and the fights against Duplessis. And Peltier once told me, um, I've known Pierre Trudeau for X number of years, decades. I love the man and everything, but I would never think of phoning him and saying, let's go out and have a beer. That's Pierre Trudeau.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. Well, this was fascinating, Ron. And I actually do offer you an open invitation to meet me somewhere for a beer or something and continue on some of these threads. But I think we've given our listeners more than enough reason to go out and buy this book. And I just want to tell people this is perhaps the most important book on Canadian politics I've ever read. And I've read so many of them. But this one feels to me like it's giving me the goods, the unvarnished goods, in a way that nothing else I've ever read does. And so all I can tell you is, folks, I know this happened 50 years ago, but politics is eternal. And some of these lessons are forever. And this is, if you are involved in politics or interested in politics, read this book.
Thank you. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Right. Ron, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. Herle Burly-ites, all of you out there who watched or listened, thank you for sharing your time with us. And to all the sponsors who make this possible, thank you very much. And we'll be back next week with something good, but probably not this good. See you then.
Burly, burly.